She was invisible, just a maid cleaning the same rooms every day, until the sheriff fell from his horse, bleeding and dying on a muddy road. Her hands moved with impossible skill, saving his life with knowledge no servant should possess. But those healing hands carried a deadly secret from her past, one that could destroy everything she'd built. What was she hiding? And why would saving someone reveal the very truth that could kill her future? Hit that like button, subscribe for more incredible stories, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from right now, because this story of secrets, sacrifice, and forbidden love will leave you breathless. Eleanor's hands moved across the polished mahogany with practiced precision, the cloth held like a prayer between her fingers. Each stroke erased the day's accumulation of dust from Judge Hartwell's study, but could not sweep away the weight that pressed against her ribs like a stone. Outside the window, autumn leaves spiraled downward in their eternal dance of surrender, and she watched them with the hollow recognition of one who understood falling. The grandfather clock in the corner marked the hour with a resonant chime that seemed to echo through her bones. 3 years she had worked in this house, 3 years of invisibility carefully cultivated like a garden of shadows. She had perfected the art of existing between breaths, of moving through rooms like morning mist that dissipates before anyone can quite grasp its presence. Her reflection caught in the glass of the bookcase, a woman of 26 with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, eyes the color of winter storms, and hands that spoke of labor but carried themselves with an unconscious grace that no amount of scrubbing could diminish. She turned away quickly, as if her own image might betray the secrets she harbored. The leather-bound volumes surrounding her held stories of law and order, of justice served and wrongs made right. How different her own story would read if anyone dared to open that particular book. But Eleanor had learned long ago that survival meant keeping certain pages sealed, certain chapters unwritten. She folded the cloth and placed it in her basket, with movements precise as clockwork. Tomorrow would bring the same ritual, the same careful dance around the truth. But tonight, as every night, she would return to her small room above the carriage house and trace her fingers over the silver locket she kept hidden beneath her pillow, the only remnant of a life that felt more like a dream than memory. The house settled around her with familiar sighs and creaks, a wooden ship weathering another day's storm. Eleanor extinguished the lamp and made her way through the darkened hallways, carrying her secrets like candles in the wind. The morning brought with it a restlessness that seemed to infect the very air. Eleanor felt it as she went about her duties, an electric tension that made her skin prickle and her movements more hurried than usual. Mrs. Hartwell had departed early for her weekly visit to the ladies' auxiliary, leaving the house in that particular kind of silence that precedes upheaval. Eleanor was hanging linens on the line behind the kitchen when she heard the commotion from the main street. Voices raised in alarm, the thunder of hooves, shouts carrying on the wind like harbingers. She paused, a white sheet billowing in her hands like a flag of surrender, and listened to the town, awakening to some crisis. Through the hedge separating the Hartwell property from the main thoroughfare, she caught glimpses of people running. Women, clutching shawls, men abandoning their storefronts. The morning light, filtering through the gathering clouds, cast everything in a sepia tone that made the scene feel already like a memory. "There's been an accident," came a voice from the garden gate. Eleanor turned to see Sarah, the butcher's daughter, her usually neat appearance disheveled with haste. "Sheriff Morrison! His horse threw him near the old mill. They think he might be badly hurt." Eleanor's hand stilled on the clothesline. She knew Sheriff Morrison by sight, a tall man with graying temples and eyes that seemed to see too much. He had always nodded to her respectfully in passing, one of the few people in town who acknowledged her existence with anything approaching warmth. The thought of him lying injured sent an unexpected pang through her chest. They're trying to move him to Doc Patterson's, but... Sarah's voice trailed off, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from witnessing fragility in those we consider invincible. Eleanor abandoned the laundry without a second thought, her feet already carrying her toward the gate. She didn't question the impulse that drove her forward, only knew that somewhere in the space between her heartbeats, a decision had been made. The secret she carried would have to take second place to whatever was calling her toward the mill road. The wind picked up, sending the forgotten sheet dancing against the sky like a ghost reaching for heaven. The old mill road curved like a question mark through the valley, its surface rutted and treacherous after the previous night's rain. Eleanor arrived to find a cluster of men standing in awkward poses around the fallen sheriff, their hands hanging, useless at their sides, in the way of people unaccustomed to helplessness. Sheriff Morrison lay unnaturally still beside a rain-swollen ditch, his chestnut mare standing several yards away, reins trailing in the mud, sides heaving with nervous energy. Eleanor could see the problem immediately, his left leg bent at an angle that made her stomach clench, and beneath his head a small pool of crimson darkened the earth. "We can't move him," Doc Patterson was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "Not without a proper stretcher. The way his leg is positioned, we could make everything worse." Eleanor pushed through the circle of onlookers, her usual invisibility, forgotten in the face of need. She knelt in the mud beside the sheriff without ceremony, her trained eyes, trained in ways these men could never imagine, assessing his condition with swift competence. "He's losing blood," she said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that made the men step back in surprise. She pressed her handkerchief against the gash on his temple, applying pressure with steady fingers. "And his breathing is too shallow." Doc Patterson stared at her. "Eleanor, how do you know? We need to stabilize his leg before moving him," she interrupted, already calculating angles and possibilities. "And we need to do it now." The sheriff's eyelids fluttered, revealing a glimpse of brown eyes clouded with pain. For a moment, their gazes met, and Eleanor saw something in his expression shift. A recognition, perhaps, or simply gratitude. His lips moved as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Eleanor placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "Don't try to talk," she murmured. "Save your strength." Around them, the autumn wind sighed through the bare branches, and the mill wheel creaked in its eternal rotation. Eleanor felt the weight of watching eyes, but for the first time in 3 years, she didn't shrink from the attention. There were things more important than remaining hidden. Eleanor's hands worked with a sureness that seemed to surprise even her. She directed the men to remove fence rails from the nearby property, showing them how to fashion a makeshift stretcher that would keep the sheriff's spine straight during transport. Her movements held the precision of muscle memory, of skills learned in another life, another world. "You'll need to lift him all at once," she instructed, positioning herself at his head. "On my count, slow and steady." Doc Patterson watched, her with growing bewilderment. "Eleanor, where did you learn? 1, 2... She ignored his question, focused entirely on the man before her. As they lifted, Sheriff Morrison's eyes found hers again, and she saw him trying to study her face, despite his pain. There was something in his gaze, not suspicion but curiosity, as if he had suddenly noticed the existence of a star that had always been in the sky. The journey to Doc Patterson's office passed in a blur of careful steps and whispered directions. Eleanor walked alongside the makeshift stretcher, her hand maintaining gentle pressure on the bandage she had fashioned from her petticoat. Blood had stained her dress, but she seemed unconscious of it, her attention focused entirely on monitoring the sheriff's breathing, the color of his lips, the flutter of his pulse. In the doctor's office, she helped transfer him to the examination table with the same fluid competence. Only when Doc Patterson began his proper examination did she step back, suddenly aware of the picture she must present. A maid covered in mud and blood, having taken charge of a situation far beyond her supposed station. "You saved his life," Doc Patterson said softly, not looking up from his patient. "If you hadn't known how to treat that head wound, how to stabilize him for transport." He paused, his hands still working. Where exactly did a maid learn such skills? Eleanor felt the familiar weight settle back onto her shoulders, the pressing need to explain, to justify, to minimize. Instead, she simply said, "I should return to my duties," and turned toward the door. "Eleanor!" Sheriff Morrison's voice stopped her, weak but clear. She looked back to find his eyes still fixed on her, something unreadable in their depths. "Thank you." The words followed her out into the afternoon light, echoing in her mind as she made her way back to the Hartwell house, her muddy shoes marking a trail on the sidewalk like breadcrumbs leading away from the scene of revelation. News of Eleanor's actions spread through the town like ripples in a still pond, each retelling adding new layers of embellishment and speculation. By evening, she had transformed in the local consciousness from invisible servant to mysterious healer, and the weight of attention made her feel as though she were walking through a world made of glass. Mrs. Hartwell returned from her auxiliary, meeting with eyebrows raised and questions multiplying behind her pale eyes. She found Eleanor in the kitchen, scrubbing bloodstains from her dress with the same methodical attention she brought to all her tasks. "I understand there was quite a commotion today," Mrs. Hartwell said, settling herself in the kitchen chair, like a bird preparing to interrogate a worm. "And that you were involved," Eleanor continued, scrubbing. "Sheriff Morrison was injured. I helped where I could." "Helped?" Mrs. Hartwell's voice carried the sharp edge of suspicion. "From what? I hear you took charge of the entire situation. Dr. Patterson is telling everyone you knew exactly what to do, as if you'd had medical training." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Eleanor felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, the same sensation she'd lived with every day for 3 years. But underneath it, something else stirred, a warmth that had nothing to do with fear. "I've read books," Eleanor said finally, which was true, if not the entire truth. Mrs. Hartwell studied her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "What books? Where? You're just a—" She stopped, the unspoken word "Maid" hanging between them like a judgment. Eleanor met her gaze steadily, no longer able to shrink into the shadows as she once had. Something had shifted irrevocably on that muddy road. Some carefully maintained barrier had cracked, and there was no returning to what had been. "I'm going to check on Sheriff Morrison tomorrow," Eleanor said quietly, "to see how he's recovering." Mrs. Hartwell's mouth opened in surprise, then closed again. In all the time Eleanor had worked for her, she had never made such a declaration, never asserted her right to act independently. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Finally, Mrs. Hartwell nodded slowly. "I suppose that would be appropriate, given the circumstances." Eleanor hung her dress by the fire to dry and retreated to her room above the carriage house. There, alone with the familiar shadows, she took out her silver locket and held it to the lamplight. Inside was a photograph so faded it was barely visible, a woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, wearing a nurse's uniform. "I tried to forget," Eleanor whispered to the image. "But maybe some things aren't meant to be forgotten." The next afternoon found Eleanor standing before Doc Patterson's office, a basket of fresh-baked bread in her hands, and uncertainty heavy in her heart. Through the window, she could see Sheriff Morrison propped up in bed, his leg elevated, and his head properly bandaged. The sight of him conscious and alert sent a flutter of relief through her chest that surprised her with its intensity. Doc Patterson answered her knock with a smile that seemed to carry secrets. Eleanor, I was hoping you'd come. Our patient has been asking about you." The words sent heat rising in her cheeks. She followed the doctor inside, her footsteps careful and measured, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened as she approached the sheriff's bedside. "Miss Eleanor." Sheriff Morrison's voice was stronger today, and when he smiled, she noticed how it transformed his entire face. "I hear I have you to thank for my continued existence." She set the basket on the bedside table, using the movement to avoid meeting his eyes directly. Anyone would have done the same. Would they? He studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see through the layers of deception she had wrapped around herself. "Doc tells me you have quite a gift for healing. Said you handled my injuries like someone with improper training." Eleanor felt the familiar trap closing around her. Too much attention, too many questions. She needed to deflect, to minimize, to disappear back into the comfortable anonymity she had cultivated. But when she looked up and met his brown eyes, she found herself unable to look away. "I've always been interested in helping people," she said carefully. He nodded slowly, as if this explanation satisfied him, but she could see the curiosity still burning behind his gaze. "Well, I'm grateful, very grateful." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about the woman who saved my life." Doc Patterson cleared his throat. "Eleanor, would you mind helping me change his bandages? Your touch seems to have a calming effect on patients." As she worked, Eleanor became acutely aware of the sheriff watching her hands, noting the competent way she cleaned and dressed his wounds, the gentle efficiency of her movements. She tried to keep her touch professional, clinical, but found herself lingering, perhaps a moment longer than necessary, when their skin touched. "You have very kind hands," Sheriff Morrison said softly, so only she could hear. Eleanor's breath caught. She finished securing the bandage and stepped back, her cheeks warm. "They're just hands." "No," he said, his voice gentle but certain. "They're healing hands, and they belong to someone far more remarkable than this town realizes." Something in his tone made her look at him directly, and what she saw in his eyes made her chest tighten with something dangerously close to hope. In the days that followed, Eleanor found herself drawn to the doctor's office like a moth to flame. She told herself it was simple concern for a patient's welfare, but the truth sat heavier in her chest. She looked forward to those moments of connection, to the way Sheriff Morrison's eyes lit up when she entered the room, to the conversations that grew longer and more intimate with each visit. "You know," he said one afternoon as she adjusted his pillows, "you never told me your surname." Eleanor's hands stilled. "Does it matter?" "Everything about you matters," he replied quietly, and the simple honesty in his voice made her heart skip. "But I understand if you prefer to keep some mysteries." She appreciated that he didn't push, didn't demand explanations the way Mrs. Hartwell did with her pointed questions and suspicious glances. Instead, Sheriff Morrison, "Please." "Call me Thomas," he had insisted, spoke to her as if she were worthy of respect, of genuine interest. It was a sensation she had almost forgotten. "Whitmore," she said finally. "Eleanor Whitmore." He smiled. "It's a pleasure to properly meet you, Eleanor Whitmore." The warmth in his voice wrapped around her name like a caress, and she felt something inside her chest uncurl, like a flower turning toward sunlight. But with the warmth came fear. The deeper she allowed herself to feel, the more precarious her position became. Secrets had weight, and she could feel hers pressing against her ribs like birds desperate to take flight. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor removed her locket and held it to the candlelight. The woman in the photograph seemed to gaze back at her with gentle reproach, as if asking why her daughter was living a lie when she had raised her to be proud of who she was. "Because pride is a luxury I can't afford," Eleanor whispered to the image. because some truths are too dangerous to tell. But even as she spoke the words, she felt their weight lessening, as if Thomas Morrison's kind eyes and gentle voice were slowly wearing away the walls she had built around her heart. The thought both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. Outside her window, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the world in a blanket of fresh possibility. Eleanor watched the flakes dance past her candle's glow and wondered if perhaps some secrets were meant to be kept only until the right person came along to share them with. Thomas Morrison's recovery progressed steadily, much to Doc Patterson's satisfaction and Eleanor's secret relief. Soon he would be well, enough to return to his duties, to his life, and she would retreat back into the shadows where she belonged. The thought should have brought comfort. Safety lay in anonymity, but instead it left her with an ache she couldn't quite name. Miss Whitmore. Thomas's voice interrupted her melancholy as she gathered the tea service from his bedside table. I have a favor to ask. She paused, teapot suspended between table and tray. Of course. When Doc Patterson releases me, which should be any day now, I was hoping you might accompany me for a walk. Nothing strenuous, he added quickly, perhaps noting her expression. Just around the town square. I find I'm curious to see familiar places through your eyes. The invitation hung between them, like a bridge she wasn't sure she dared cross. Walking publicly with Sheriff Morrison would invite questions, speculation, perhaps even gossip. It would be the antithesis of the invisibility she had carefully maintained. I'm not sure that would be appropriate, she said carefully, given our different stations. His expression darkened slightly. Your station? Eleanor, you saved my life. You've shown more medical knowledge than half the men in this town. Station is what we make it, not what others assign to us. The passion in his voice surprised her, and she looked up to find his brown eyes blazing with something that made her pulse quicken. In that moment, she saw not the town sheriff, but a man who valued her for reasons that had nothing to do with social hierarchy. People will talk, she said softly. Let them talk. He reached out and gently touched her hand, the contact sending warmth shooting up her arm. I care more about what you think than what they whisper. Eleanor stared down at their joined hands, his large and weathered from years of work, hers smaller but equally marked by labor. Yet together they seemed to fit perfectly, like pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their proper place. One walk, she heard herself say, the words emerging without conscious decision. Around the square. Thomas smiled, and the radiance of it seemed to illuminate the entire room. One walk, he agreed, for now. The promise in those last two words followed Eleanor out of the doctor's office and accompanied her through the rest of her day's duties. For the first time in 3 years, she found herself looking forward to something beyond mere survival. The day of their walk dawned crisp and clear, with winter sunlight streaming through bare branches like cathedral rays. Eleanor had risen, early to complete her morning duties, trying to ignore the flutter of nervousness in her stomach and the unusual amount of time she spent arranging her hair before the cracked mirror in her room. Thomas waited for her by the fountain in the town square, leaning lightly on a walking stick, but otherwise appearing fully recovered. He had dressed carefully too, she noticed, in his best coat and hat, as if this simple walk were an occasion worthy of ceremony. Miss Whitmore. He removed his hat as she approached, a gesture of respect that still surprised her. Thank you for indulging an injured man's whim. I'm happy to see you recovered enough for such excursions, she replied, though her voice sounded formal to her own ears. In public, surrounded by the familiar architecture of secrecy and social convention, it was harder to maintain the easy rapport they had developed in the privacy of the doctor's office. They began walking slowly around the perimeter of the square, their footsteps echoing on the frost-touched stones. Eleanor was acutely aware of the eyes following them. Shopkeepers pausing in their doorways, women clustering behind curtains, children stopping their games to stare at the unusual sight of the town sheriff walking arm in arm with the Hartwell maid. "You're tensing up," Thomas observed quietly. "Their stares can't actually harm you, you know." Eleanor tried to relax her shoulders. "You say that because you've never lived as an outsider." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "Actually, I know more about being an outsider than you might think. I wasn't born in this town, Eleanor. I came here 5 years ago, running from my own set of ghosts." She looked at him in surprise. In all their conversations, he had never mentioned a life before becoming sheriff. What kind of ghosts? The kind that whisper that you're not good enough, that you don't deserve happiness, that the past defines your future, whether you want it to or not. His voice carried a weight of old pain that resonated in her bones. "But I've learned that sometimes the only way to silence them is to stop running and start living." They paused by the old oak tree that dominated the center of the square, its branches reaching toward the sky like arms in supplication. Eleanor felt the truth of his words settling into her chest, heavy and warm and terrifying. "What if the ghosts are right?" she asked softly. "What if the past really does define us?" Thomas turned to face her fully, his brown eyes serious. "Then we're both lost. But I prefer to believe that who we are in this moment matters more than who we were before." A gust of wind sent dried leaves skittering across the stones around their feet, and Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter. But the chill she felt had little to do with the weather, and everything to do with the growing certainty that her carefully constructed life was about to change forever. That evening, Eleanor sat in her small room with her mother's locket open in her palm, the faded photograph catching the candlelight. The woman in the image had died when Eleanor was 20, leaving behind a daughter trained in the healing arts, but born into a world that didn't welcome such knowledge in unmarried women of uncertain status. Eleanor traced her finger over the familiar features, remembering the gentle hands that had taught her to clean wounds, to recognize the signs of fever, to ease pain with touch and instinct. Her mother had been midwife and healer to the poor, in their district of London, revered by some, suspected by others of practicing medicine without license, a crime that could lead to imprisonment or worse. When the authorities finally came, Eleanor had fled with nothing but her mother's locket and the skills that lived in her hands. She had spent 3 years creating a new identity, burying her past so deep she sometimes forgot it existed. Until Thomas Morrison fell from his horse and her hands remembered what they were meant to do. A knock at her door interrupted her reverie. She quickly closed the locket and tucked it away before opening the door to find Mrs. Hartwell standing in the hallway, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "May I come in, Eleanor?" It was the first time her employer had ever visited her private quarters, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. She stepped aside to allow Mrs. Hartwell entry, noting how the woman's eyes swept the small space, taking inventory of the few personal possessions visible. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day," Mrs. Hartwell began without preamble, "about your unusual knowledge of medical matters." Eleanor remained silent, having learned that sometimes saying nothing was safer than saying too little or too much. "Judge Hartwell has been making inquiries," Mrs. Hartwell continued, "about your background, your references from your previous employment." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. She had prepared for this possibility, had forged documents, and created a history that should withstand casual scrutiny. But if the judge was conducting serious inquiries— "He means no harm," Mrs. Hartwell said quickly, perhaps noting Eleanor's pallor. "But the sheriff's accident has drawn attention to you, and people are asking questions about why a maid would have such knowledge, such authority in medical matters. Eleanor sank into her single chair, feeling the weight of 3 years' careful deception pressing down on her shoulders. What did you tell him? The truth, that you came to us with excellent references and have been a model employee. Mrs. Hartwell paused, studying Eleanor's face. But I suspect there's more truth you haven't shared, and I think perhaps it's time you trusted me with it. The kindness in her employer's voice was unexpected, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. She had grown so accustomed to suspicion and judgment that simple compassion seemed like a foreign language. Some truths are dangerous to share, Eleanor said finally. Mrs. Hartwell nodded slowly. Yes, but sometimes keeping them is more dangerous still. Eleanor spent a sleepless night weighing her options, each possibility carrying its own burden of risk and regret. By morning, she had reached a decision that felt as inevitable as sunrise. She would tell Thomas the truth. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The distinction felt monumental. She found him at his office, having returned to light duties despite Doc Patterson's protests. He looked up from his paperwork when she entered, and his face brightened in a way that made her chest tight with affection and fear. Eleanor, this is an unexpected pleasure. She closed the door behind her and moved to stand before his desk, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I need to tell you something about who I really am. Thomas set down his pen and gave her his full attention. The sunlight streaming through the window behind him cast his face in partial shadow, making his expression difficult to read. Before I came here, Eleanor began, her voice barely above a whisper. I lived in London with my mother. She was a healer, a midwife. She taught me everything she knew about medicine, about helping people. She paused, gathering courage. But women like us, without proper credentials or male oversight, weren't welcome in the medical profession. When the authorities came for her, she stopped, unable to continue. The memory of that night, her mother's arrest, the accusations of practicing medicine illegally, the shame and fear that followed, still had the power to rob her of breath. Thomas rose from his chair and came around the desk to stand before her. What happened to her? She died in prison before her trial. The words came out flat, emotionless, as if by removing all feeling she could make them less true. I fled with nothing but her locket and the knowledge she'd given me. I've been hiding ever since. Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and cupped her face in his hands. His touch was gentle, reverent, as if she were something precious that might break. You're not hiding anymore, he said softly. You saved my life, Eleanor. How can you see that as anything but a blessing? Because it exposed me, because now people are asking questions I can't answer without endangering everything I've built here. Then maybe it's time to stop building walls and start building something else, Thomas suggested. Something that doesn't require you to hide who you are. Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw not judgment but acceptance, not fear but admiration. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she didn't have to carry her secrets alone. What are you saying? She whispered. Thomas smiled, and in that smile she saw all the hope she had been afraid to feel. I'm saying that this town could use someone with your skills, someone who can help people, the way you helped me, and I'm saying that you don't have to face whatever comes next by yourself. Eleanor felt something inside her chest crack open, like ice breaking up in spring. The fear was still there, would probably always be there, but underneath it bloomed. Something she had almost forgotten existed, hope. Word of Eleanor's background spread through the town like wildfire in dry grass. Judge Hartwell's inquiries had yielded results neither he nor Eleanor had expected. a letter from London detailing her mother's arrest and death, painting Eleanor as the dangerous daughter of a criminal who had practiced medicine without license. Eleanor learned of it when Mrs. Hartwell burst into the kitchen where she was preparing the evening meal, her face flushed with indignation and something that might have been fear. "They're saying terrible things," Mrs. Hartwell announced without preamble. "That you're some sort of criminal, that your mother was arrested for illegal medical practice, that you've been deceiving us all." Eleanor set down her wooden spoon with hands that trembled only slightly. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it in her mind, if not her heart. But the reality of exposure felt like standing, naked in a blizzard. "Some of it is true," she said quietly. "My mother was arrested, but she wasn't a criminal. She was a healer who helped people who couldn't afford doctors, who saved lives the medical establishment ignored. And you," Mrs. Hartwell's voice carried a mixture of curiosity and concern, "are you like her?" Eleanor met her employer's gaze directly. "Yes, I am exactly like her." Before Mrs. Hartwell could respond, they heard voices from the front of the house, Judge Hartwell's deep tones mingling with others Eleanor didn't recognize. Mrs. Hartwell's face went pale. "They're here for you," she whispered. "The judge, Councilman Peters, several others. They want to question you." Eleanor felt the familiar urge to flee, to gather her few possessions and disappear into the night, as she had done 3 years ago. But this time, something held her in place. The memory of Thomas's hands on her face, his voice promising she wouldn't have to face whatever came next alone. "Then I'll meet them," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. She untied her apron and hung it on its peg, then walked through the house toward the voices in the front parlor. Each step felt like walking toward her own judgment, but she held her head high, carrying her mother's dignity in the set of her shoulders. The men fell silent when she entered the room. Judge Hartwell stood behind his desk like a fortress, while the others arranged themselves around the room in poses that suggested both authority and discomfort. "Miss Whitmore," Judge Hartwell said formally. "Or should I say, Miss Eleanor Blackwood of London." Eleanor's breath caught. They knew her real name, her true identity. There was no retreat left to her now. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she said clearly. "I chose it when I came here, when I chose to start my life over. But yes, I was born Eleanor Blackwood. And your mother was a healer who gave her life helping people who had nowhere else to turn." Judge Hartwell leaned forward. "She was arrested for practicing medicine without a license, for breaking the law. She was arrested for being poor and female and possessing knowledge that threatened those in power," Eleanor replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Just as I am being questioned now for the same crime, being a woman who dares to know how to save lives." The silence that followed her words stretched taut as a violin string. Eleanor stood in the center of it, no longer the invisible maid, but a woman claiming her place in the world. Consequences be damned. The confrontation. In Judge Hartwell's parlor, stretched through the evening like a trial without judge or jury, Eleanor answered every question with steady composure, neither apologizing for her heritage nor embellishing her qualifications. She spoke of her mother's work, of the skills passed down through generations of women who healed with hands and heart rather than formal education. Councilman Peters, a thin man with nervous eyes, shifted in his chair. "But surely you understand the concern. A woman with no formal training, no oversight, treating patients. It's highly irregular." "Is it more irregular than letting people suffer?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Sheriff Morrison is alive because I acted. Would you prefer I had stayed in my place and let him die in service to propriety?" The question hung in the air like a challenge none of the men seemed willing to accept. Judge Hartwell cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. The issue isn't your intentions, Miss Whitmore. It's the deception. You came to work for us under false pretenses. I came to work for you as a woman, seeking a quiet life after tragedy, Eleanor corrected. I never claimed to be anything other than what you saw. Someone willing to work hard and cause no trouble. At that moment, Thomas Morrison appeared, in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention, despite his walking stick and still healing injuries. "Gentlemen," he said with polite formality that didn't quite mask the steel beneath. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption, but I couldn't help feeling that this conversation concerns me directly." Judge Hartwell frowned. "Sheriff, this is a private matter." "With all due respect, Judge, my life is hardly a private matter." Thomas moved into the room with careful dignity, positioning himself near Eleanor in a gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on anyone present. "And Miss Whitmore's actions in saving that life are a matter of public record." He turned to address the room at large, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "Gentlemen, we live in a time of change. Women are beginning to attend medical schools in the East to practice healing arts that have long been denied them. Are we to punish someone for possessing knowledge that could benefit our community?" Councilman Peters squirmed. "But the law—" "Has Miss Whitmore broken any laws in our jurisdiction?" Thomas interrupted. "Has she harmed anyone, charged money for medical services, practiced beyond her abilities?" He paused, letting his gaze travel around the room. "Or has she simply saved a life when no one else could?" Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude so intense it made her knees weak. To have someone defend her, to stand beside her and speak for her worth, it was a gift she had never expected to receive. "The question isn't whether Miss Whitmore deserves punishment," Thomas continued. "It's whether our community deserves to benefit from her skills. As sheriff, I can tell you that we have a shortage of medical care, particularly for those who can't afford Doc Patterson's fees. Perhaps instead of condemning her, we should be asking how she might serve our town openly and honorably." The silence that followed his words felt different than before, less accusatory, more thoughtful. Eleanor dared to hope that perhaps the tide was turning in her favor. Judge Hartwell looked from Thomas to Eleanor and back again, his expression unreadable. "This is highly irregular," he said finally, "but then these are irregular times." He sighed. "I propose we table this discussion until we can consult with broader authorities about the legal implications." It wasn't absolution, but it wasn't condemnation either. Eleanor felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as the men began to file out of the room, murmuring among themselves. Only Thomas remained, moving to stand beside her as they listened to the front door close behind the last visitor. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly when they were alone. "You didn't have to do that." Thomas turned to face her, his brown eyes warm with something that made her pulse quicken. "Yes, I did. Because I meant what I said. This town needs you. And because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words. Eleanor waited, her heart beating like a trapped bird in her chest. "Because I need you," he finished quietly. "Not just as the woman who saved my life, but as the woman who saved my heart." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Thomas, I know it's complicated. I know there will be challenges. But I also know that watching you stand there tonight, owning who you are despite the cost, was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." He reached out and took her hand, threading their fingers together. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands and felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced since her mother's death. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in 3 years, she wouldn't have to walk it alone. Spring arrived early that year, painting the valley in shades of green hope and golden possibility. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the small clinic that had once been the old harness shop, watching Thomas hang the freshly painted sign that read "Whitmore Healing Services" in elegant script. The winter had brought challenges none of them had anticipated. There had been meetings with territorial authorities, letters exchanged with medical boards in the East, and countless conversations about precedent and propriety. But Thomas had proven as tenacious in his advocacy as Eleanor had been resilient in the face of scrutiny. The solution, when it came, had been simple in its innovation. Eleanor would practice under Doc Patterson's supervision, serving primarily the women and children of the community who often went without medical care. She would charge fair prices, maintain detailed records, and submit to regular reviews of her work. It was a compromise that satisfied the authorities while allowing her to use her skills openly and with dignity. "There," Thomas said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Official." Eleanor smiled, fingering the silver locket at her throat, no longer hidden beneath her dress, but worn openly, a reminder of where she came from and who she had chosen to become. Mama would have been proud. She would have been proud of who you've become, Thomas agreed, moving to stand beside her. A healer who doesn't have to hide, a woman who can help others without fear. Mrs. Hartwell approached from across the street, her arms full of fresh linens for the clinic. She had surprised everyone by becoming Eleanor's most vocal supporter once the initial shock had worn off. "I brought extra blankets," she announced, bustling past them into the clinic, and Mrs. Patterson sent over a basket of herbs from her garden. Eleanor followed her former employer inside, marveling at how the space had been transformed. Clean, white walls, gleaming instruments, shelves lined with medical supplies. It looked like the answer to dreams she hadn't dared to dream. "Your first patient will be here soon," Mrs. Hartwell said, arranging the linens on the examination table. "Young Susan Fletcher. The poor girl's been having trouble with her pregnancy, and Doc Patterson thought you might have insights he's missed." Eleanor nodded, feeling a familiar flutter of nervous excitement. Each patient would still be a test, each success a small vindication of the choices she had made. But the fear that had once accompanied such moments had been tempered by the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his presence as comforting as morning sunlight. "Ready?" Eleanor picked up her mother's medical bag, worn leather that had travelled from London to this new life, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a familiar shawl. "Ready," she said, and meant it. Outside, the town was awakening to the promise of a new day. Birds sang from the newly budding trees, children played in the streets, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour with voices full of hope. Eleanor Whitmore, healer and beloved, took her first step into a future where she no longer had to choose between hiding her truth and living her life. She had found a place where both were possible, a community that valued her skills over her gender, and a love that celebrated rather than condemned who she was meant to be. The locket at her throat caught the morning light, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the clinic walls like benedictions. Her mother's spirit lived on in each life she would touch, each pain she would ease, each hope she would help to heal. This was her new beginning, not hidden in shadows, but standing proudly in the light of her own truth, with hands that remembered their purpose, and a heart that had finally found its home.